It's Friday, January 26th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me here today at Denton's in Washington, D.C. is Karen Anderson. A Georgia native, she earned her BA in Economics from Agnes Scott College and her NPP from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Karen is currently Managing Director of the Social Finance Institute. Prior to taking this role, she served as Senior Director of Policy and Communications for the Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics at the University of Chicago, Senior Advisor to Results for America, a nonprofit promoting evidence-based policymaking, and Managing Director for the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institute. A veteran of two White Houses, Karen served as Chief of Staff for the Council of Economic Advisors for the Obama administration and a regional coordinator in the White House Office of Political Affairs during the Clinton administration. She also spent some time as a Vice President of State and Local Government Relations for Citigroup and Senior Policy Advisor at McKenna, Long & Aldridge, now known as Denton's, here in Washington, D.C. In the area of Georgia politics, Karen was Special Projects Director and Political Director for the Democratic Party of Georgia during the early 1990s. Thank you, Karen, for coming out on a sweltering Friday here in the district.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad we could sit down and talk about your time in Georgia politics. Tell me about your childhood and upbringing. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Athens, Georgia. Both of my parents were involved with the university. My father was faculty, my mother had arts and sciences, a geneticist, and my mom was in the business school. And I grew up in the Clark County school system, proud graduate of Cedar Shoals High School. I will admit Athens is a little small if you grow up there, and this is before Hope Scholarship, when you had the incentive to stay and go to the flagship university, but had the opportunity with Agnes Scott College. They offered me financial support, and it seemed like an amazing opportunity to go to a great school, but also hit the Atlanta area. So I went to Agnes Scott and had a great 4 years there, and as you mentioned, studying economics and lots of other things.
Now, were you interested in politics growing up, or was that something that you got involved in college or afterward?
Great question. My parents were, I would say, informed activists. They weren't out, really. They weren't. Can I start and stop? Y'all edit this. Yeah. My parents were very engaged consumers of information. They were Democrats. They really cared about the state of education, the world, and so we were the family that always sat and, regardless of who the president was, watched any of the presidential addresses, read the papers. So I wasn't politically active, but I was politically interested. When I was in college, I got very involved in student government and ended up being the president of the Student Government Association, and became really interested. I was in school during the 1988 convention in Democratic Convention in Atlanta, which got me very, very excited, and spurred me to really think about what a career in politics could look like.
So tell me, what was it about that experience in particular that got you from interested consumer of civics and of current events to somebody who's like, maybe I should do this as a form of work, a job, a career?
I think one of the best parts of being a college student is that you have the privilege and advantage of being an idealist. And as I studied economics and I studied Latin American studies, you'd start really looking at the plight of disadvantaged communities. At that point, I was studying a lot about Latin America, and that was in the age of, Contra, and there was a lot of conflict, and became very politically active, and was the student who would drive to DC and participate in a march and a protest and go to my members' offices, and I'm sure they loved those visits, but really felt very, very passionate about issues. And with the Democratic Convention, it wasn't so much that I was interested in the convention itself, but it was so local and had made such an impression that I became much more interested in the just in the campaign. I was writing for the school papers, did I think an article or two about it, and didn't have any kind of, I think, idea in my head of what a path into politics could be, right? I mean, this is back before internet. You know, if you didn't have a parent involved in politics or a mentor or someone in your, you know, ecosystem, which I did not, it was sort of a, you know, impossible barrier. How would you even move into that? So I hadn't thought about it. I majored in economics, and I actually accepted a job at a bank training program.
Okay.
And so ended up thinking I was going to graduate and do a bank training program, and then in the 11th hour thought, oh my God, that sounds awful. I don't want to do the bank training program. And literally went to the career services office, and they had the old binders, you know, flyers that you could look at, because again, there's no internet. And there was so I graduated in 1990. There was some old flyers from the Democratic Party, and none of it was even current. But I remember looking at it thinking, boy, you know what would be really interesting is to like go work at the Democratic Party. And I went to the head of career services, and I will say this is the tremendous advantage of being at a small school where they give you a lot of hands-on attention. And the head of career services said, well, I don't know if they have any opportunities, but why don't I call over to the Democratic Party of Georgia offices for you and see if they have an internship? That's a great way to get your foot in the door. And I said, wow, that'd be great. And at that point, there was a gentleman named Charlie Schroeder, who has since passed, an amazing guy who was the executive director of the Democratic Party. Scotty Greenwood was the finance director at the time. Even though they had booked their internships for the summer, said, come in and we'll at least talk to you. And went in and had conversations with Scotty and Charlie, and they said, you know what, if you want to be an intern, we'll give you a slot for the summer. I think they paid me $150 a week, no benefits. And I said, you know, I really want to be an opposition research intern. I don't want to do, I mean, think about what day this was. Usually women would be put into fundraising events, and I said I really would like to do opposition research, which I think was a little startling. And Charlie, to his credit, said, great, I'm going to give you a chance. And I went into the back office with all the guys who were smoking their cigarettes, and
as was the time.
And got to spend the summer doing opposition research. And I had to support myself, and so I had a big motivation and incentive to parlay this into a full-time job. And I was really clear with Charlie up front. I said, you know, gosh, I got to support myself, so really want to do this internship, but I'm going to have to be looking for a full-time job. Sure. And he said, I hear you. And about 6 weeks in, I stayed after work one day, sort of held my breath, went into his office and said, okay, I really, really love what I'm doing, but I need a full-time job. And he hired me as a special projects, my title, special projects director. And I mean, I think I got paid $1,000 a month, but I got health benefits. So we were not talking about massive wages, but it was an amazing opportunity, because getting into politics is super hard. And unless you have someone to give you a path, if you're just coming in from the outside, it's almost impossible. So I am incredibly grateful that they gave me, sight unseen, this random person, an opportunity to at least prove myself, and being a woman, to prove myself in sort of the area of policy and research, which is what I was interested in.
Yeah.
And I'm forever grateful.
Now, you said that you were an opposition researcher. This would have been summer 1990, so this would have been election
I was
year.
assigned to Johnny Isakson.
Okay. Well, tell me about trying to dig up dirt on Johnny Isakson.
Because,
the late, great Johnny Isakson.
Well, and at this point too, when I was hired, we didn't know who the Democratic nominee would be.
Right, because
there were,
Andy
a gazillion
Young
people in
Roy
the field,
Barnes.
but we had a really good sense it was going to be Johnny Isakson on the Republican side.
Yeah.
At that point, voting records, since he had been in the state legislature, again, nothing was digitized. So there were two sets of these big red binders. I'm sure you've seen them. They're these old big red, I don't know what you would even call them. They're not even ledgers, I guess giant ledgers,
Sort
where they
of
would
like
by hand
gallery size,
record the votes. And there was one set in the Speaker's office, it was Speaker Murphy at the time, and one set in the archives. And I spent my whole summer sometimes in the Speaker's office, but sometimes it was a little easier to just work out of the archives, and literally recording votes. And then I would come back to the office and put it all into the computer, because again, no laptops. And so it was, a painstaking process, but I really wanted to prove my worth, and I took it very, very seriously, and would take my sandwich and head into the windowless archives and
right, back when archives
my
were
day.
still downtown.
Yeah.
So you parlayed that into special projects, which would have been August, September of 1990. How did your job change as you went into the fall general election?
Another great question. It's hard to envision this now because the politics in the state have changed so much, but traditionally, up until Sonny Perdue, we had always had Democratic governors in Georgia.
That's right.
And the Democratic governor would de facto be the head of the party and decide who the chair of the party would be, and there was a lot of influence over the staffing. And so when Zell Miller got the nomination, they did a lot of cleaning up, a lot of turnover in the party, and brought in some of Zell's people, brought in some new people. Ed Sims was brought in as the chair of the Democratic Party, and I am, again, very, very fortunate that I was one of the folks they kept on board, and not only kept on board, but really empowered me and started giving me more and more projects. And so I had that mindset of do whatever however big or however small, do whatever task they throw your way. And I think I did everything from helping organize events, doing research. I ran the internship program, volunteer program. So we would do phone banks at night till 9 at night, and I would stay there and do the phone bank program. We did, if we had mailings to do, this was back when you would sort the mail by hand to get the bulk mailing, many Saturdays doing the bulk mailing. We did everything, and they increasingly gave me more and more responsibility. Really the greatest opportunity, and this is actually what I thought you had brought me in to talk about, was, Governor Miller was and Keith Mason, so strategic and so forward-looking, and they had already started looking down to the 92 presidential election, which was an enormously crowded field. And within that field was the very little-known governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who had a very close relationship with Governor Miller. And at that point, you would have Iowa caucus, New Hampshire primary, and then you flipped right into Super Tuesday. And they rightly assumed, Clinton is not going to do great in Iowa. He's not going to do great in New Hampshire, and then he's going to come into Super Tuesday. So along with Gordon Giffen and a lot of others, Ed Sims, they came up with this plan of we need to move the Georgia primary date a week early, which is not a simple task, so that after Iowa, after New Hampshire, Clinton could come to Georgia, win a presidential primary that launches him into Super Tuesday. And so I get called in, and again, I am pretty, a year out of college. I'm pretty sure I was still wearing Laura Ashley dresses, and they said, help us draft a plan. Draft the plan that is the sort of economic argument of what would be the economic benefits of having the first primary in Georgia. Let's do first, should it be caucus or primary? What's the difference? But then, how would the state benefit from having this sort of first Southern primary? And then they sent me off. And you just think, gosh, what a leap of faith.
Right.
And I talked to, my fingers were dialing professors at Emory and University of Georgia, and talking to anyone who would talk to me, and pulled together this plan, which I actually told Keith, I think I have one of the copies of it under my house, and he keeps saying, can you pull that out and give it to the archives? It would be on an old dot matrix printer, and it was our sort of economic justification. And there actually had been quite a lot written of, in New Hampshire, just the fact that everyone comes in, and the journalists and all of these sort of indirect benefits of hotel and hospitality, et cetera. And so put together this rough, 22-year-old, almost like a senior thesis project. They have a meeting and decided we're going to try to do this. And it meant two things. We had 159 counties, and we had to get the 159 counties on board. Everyone had to basically, if I recall correctly, do yes, we're okay with this. And we had to get Justice Department on board. because
because of the
Voting Rights Act. And so I was assigned putting together district level events where we could bring in all the county sort of elections folks and have a public dialogue about moving the primary date. So we set those up around the states, and I might give you a lot of good stuff. I think if I haven't thrown it out, I have an old VHS recording from local news of one of these forums that we did, and only someone had taped it for me because I'm like standing in the back, in there. But we had these caucuses or meetings around the state, had to get everybody signed on, and again, they had me deeply involved in helping organize that. And then, Gordon Giffen, working with people like Tina Flournoy, others. I mean, there was a whole a whole strategy at the federal level, and lo and behold, it gets done. And, kind of, you look back now and you're like, boy, I mean, the fact that this relatively small team of people managed to dot the I's, cross the T's, pull this off is pretty darn incredible. And I was along for the ride, but I mean, it was honestly such an exciting thing to be a part of, and at such a young age. So all of that gets done, and I get more integrated into the Georgia coordinated campaign and the Clinton campaign in Georgia. But I mean,
coordinated campaign.
Yes.
For those who don't know, what is a coordinated campaign, and how's that different from the presidential campaign or a gubernatorial campaign?
Great question. There are legal answers to that, but I'll give you the
right.
The coordinating campaign is literally coordinated out of the state Democratic Party, and it is not. There is no advocacy for a single candidate. So you would roll up Democratic candidates, and it could be presidential, Senate, gubernatorial, public service commissioner, so you're basically doing advocacy and campaigning on behalf of a ticket.
Right.
You can raise a lot of money through different channels. People who have maxed out on a presidential, maxed out on a Senate can give to a coordinated campaign, and their candidate's name is still on whatever sign or whatever ad you're putting out there. And so I was officially working still with the state Democratic Party with the coordinated campaign. We had the Clinton primary in the same office. And I mean, again, all out campaigning with the governor's full backing, and I mean, such a different day. We had, Bubbas for Clinton, sheriffs for Clinton, firefighters for Clinton. I mean, it was farmers for Clinton, you name it. We had groups campaigning, and at the end of the day, what happened? Clinton lost in Iowa, lost in New Hampshire, came and won Georgia, propelled into Super Tuesday, becomes the nominee. And then I will say on election night, general election night, Georgia was the first state called for Clinton. So I feel like, boy, we had such an enormous, but I mean, so many sleepless nights and so much effort between, all of that. And, again, for a young woman who was not of that world, increasingly more responsibility. And it was just amazing, and I loved every minute of it. And in the midst of all that, I had thought, gosh, this is sort of amazing. I'm doing this really having this opportunity, all of the campaigning, all of the strategy, but I think I need to go back to school. And I actually was applying to University of Georgia Law School, and ended up getting caught up in everything from all around the campaign, like delegate selection. They were like, oh, can you write the delegate selection plan for Georgia? And I laugh with Tina Flournoy, who is another person you should speak with if she's not on your list. Tina at that point she's from Georgia, from Savannah, but she was the general counsel at the Democratic National Committee. And the DNC sends regulations down to all the state parties saying you have to write a delegate selection plan, and here are the guidelines, and you have to have a plan for every district. And there was a lot of delegation, and I think they gave me the guidelines and said, Karen, go write the plan. And again, at this point, I'm maybe like 23, but I remember writing the plan and sending it in, and I get this call. And this person introduces herself. This is Tina Flournoy. I'm the general counsel. She said, I just looked at your delegate selection plan. You really don't have any idea what you're doing, do you? And I said, oh my God. I said, I really don't. And she goes, okay, I'm going to help you. And together we crafted it. And we laugh about that to this day. And I was like, thank God someone's like helping,
Right.
because, you know, it was a little of blind leading the blind. So did delegate selection, and then when we
Do you
had,
mind saying what you were doing wrong?
I mean, I had no experience, and I
Okay.
didn't have anyone to talk to who had gone through this.
Okay.
And so, you know, you're given a framework, but there's a lot of devil in the detail of
Right.
how to, you know, put the guidelines in place for your district
Right,
level
because
caucuses.
this is after like McGovern Commission, Hunt Commission, all
Yeah.
these rules that you
And
have
so,
to follow.
you know, I'm going to say I did my
Okay.
best, and you know, it was much better after Tina's intervention.
Sure.
And we ended up having a great delegate selection process, and we checked all the boxes, and we ended up following all the rules at the end of the day, which was what was important.
Right.
And continued working on the campaign, and then when we had our inaugural, we had the convention in New York.
Right.
Was
right.
deeply involved in organizing the events, the delegation, and then after the election, they gave me a deep role in the inaugural for the Georgia delegation in
Okay.
DC. So it was sort of every step of the way,
Yeah.
super engaged along with Scotty and others, but you know, sort of at that point in my life, probably oversized roles than met my expectations. But I look back and I'm like, boy, for a predominantly like somewhat insular guys network, I mean, if Scotty and I probably feel this way, Catrice really was very inclusive for that time for some of us, for some women, and gave us amazing opportunities and to either figure it out or hang ourselves, I guess. But for me, a really amazing growth opportunity. So sort of hung with it, working all the way through everything from campaign to inaugural. And then I thought, you know, I should probably think about applying to law school, doing something else. And then I get the call from, maybe it was Scotty, who was the executive director of the Democratic Party at the time,
Right.
saying, okay, there's an opportunity for you to go work in the White House. And I was
that
like,
even on your
no,
radar?
no. I was not considering leaving Georgia. My family was there.
Yeah.
I think my boyfriend at the time was there. I mean, I was a Georgia girl.
Yeah.
And I think I said, well, gosh, I'm not sure I want to move to DC. And I don't remember who all was part of the call, but it was okay, maybe you're not hearing what we're saying. Is there's this opportunity, and you know, a lot of people, I think, you know, Sam Nunn's people had weighed in, Zell Miller's people had weighed in, but a really amazing opportunity to go up and work in White House political affairs and be in the first batch of people in the door. I started January '93. So I was so convinced that I was coming back that I had applied to UGA, gotten accepted, deferred for 1 year, put
Okay.
all my stuff in storage, and sort of said, okay, I'm going off for a year, and got to the White House and said, okay, I'm here for 1 year, and then I'm going back. And here we are a few years later, and I'm still in DC. But I mean, it was a huge leap, and you know, talk about, you know, going from the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah.
It was, you know, a little daunting as well.
Yeah. Tell me about that. You know, January '93. This is a new Democratic administration.
Yeah.
First Democratic president inaugurated since '77.
Yeah.
What was that process like of getting a White House staff up and running, and how did that impact you?
I was so over my head and clueless as to, I mean, I hadn't even had time to think about what I should be worried about coming into this new role. And I will I will say too, Clinton years, some of the best years of my life, and many of my closest friends in DC today are my friends from the Clinton White House. Amazing experience, but when I got there, I didn't know a soul. I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. I didn't even have a place to live. I was living on someone's sofa. Someone I knew who was working in the Senate had said, you can stay on my sofa in Old Town till you find a place. I mean, so I was, you know, completely out of my depth. You know, within the White House, there's everything from, I mean, you have a lot of clearance you have to do, right?
Sure.
To, you know, there's paperwork, there's clearance, there's all kinds of things. You're hitting the ground running. It's a new administration. I was in political affairs, and that was the Clinton administration was probably one of your more political White Houses. So I was working with another Georgian, a woman named Rita Lewis, who was one of the special assistants to the president in political affairs, and she had known Gordon, Ed, Scotty, a bunch of the Georgians, and I went in to work with her, and we had 19 states we coordinated on behalf of the White House. And just keeping in mind, this is before cell phones, before laptops, before internet. And so anytime one of the four president, vice president, first lady, second lady, or cabinet member would travel to a state, they have teams to put together all of the substantive pieces, but federal employees, as you know, are not supposed to do political activity. So you have White House political affairs, which can do everything from liaising with DNC, DCCC, campaigns, to writing the political memo. So in the president's briefing book, he's going somewhere, there's all the substantive memos, and then you would have a political memo from political affairs saying, like, here are the politics of the state or things you should watch out for.
Right.
The amazing thing back then, because you couldn't just Google, and you would create this network of contacts of, it could be folks in the governor's office, the senator's office, the head of the union, depending on what the dynamics were in that state. And you'd literally pick up the phone and call and say, okay, so-and-so's coming in. Can you tell me what's going on? And what do we need to look for? And you would have all of these connections, and you really got to know these people in the states quite intimately. I mean, you were in touch all of the time. And it wasn't by text, and it wasn't by email. And you'd write up all these, memos, and you'd plan, and you'd do all these events. And it was crazy because, as you may recall, the '94 election was a bit impactful as well. And leading up into that, I mean, the president's trying to set his agenda. He's trying to consolidate support. You've got the '94 election looming. 19 states is a lot of states. We had pretty much all of the southern states in that mix too, plus New England. It was probably great to be a southerner working with the southern states, because at that point most of the southern states still had Democratic governors, but definitely more conservative Democratic governors who had have a different strategy with a lot of social issues than you might see in New England or California. Right. And so, you would find yourself in trip meetings being the advocate for, like who would be the best person to send or maybe not send, or what kind of messaging. And I mean, it was a lot. It was amazing.
So '94, the contract with America, Gingrich Revolution.
Yeah.
Within the political office, did you have pushback from people, especially in competitive districts, congressional districts, say, no, we don't want the White House anywhere near us or our race?
Yes. Depending on the state,
right.
And it could have been a state, it could have been a district, but there were folks who would be quite vocal, or if you're having someone come, here's who is acceptable and here's who's not acceptable. And so you would really have to be the ambassador for them in a way. They would have trip meetings, right?
Yeah.
We're going to send someone down to Georgia or to Florida. If Governor Miller was saying, I absolutely do not want this person in my state,
right.
It would have been a disaster to have that person show up in the state. So you had to be the person convincing the folks in the room that, here are the folks who would, and here are the reasons why. And things move so quickly, and the White House is actually a very small staff to do a lot. I mean, White House is pretty small. Compared to the rest of federal government.
Sure.
Things move really, really quickly, and a lot of things can fall through the cracks, and people look back, oh my God, how did we not remember this? And again, this is before the technology boom. Many, many years later, being back in the White House in Obama, I mean, just a whole different ball game.
Yeah.
I mean, when you can leave the office because you have a BlackBerry or a cell phone and you have your laptop and you're coordinating with people in different ways. I mean, it was a really different ball game. And so I do remember Bill Clinton's first trip as president to Georgia. Everything scheduled, and our focus had been, Sam Nunn and Zellmiller, and you're thinking state. And I'm pretty sure he was like on the plane on the way there, and someone said, "Oh my God, nobody reached out to Jimmy Carter." Right? You've got the former president sitting in Georgia, and then of course there's a scramble on that. But there hadn't been Democrats in the White House in a really long time.
Exactly.
And a lot of what you can get is institutional memory, right? When you have, you had people from Obama going, a lot of people from Clinton who were in Obama, a lot of people from Obama and Biden.
Right.
You get a lot of institutional memory. When you have you basically have no one there who's done it before, you're
which goes a long way
putting
to
processes in place.
Historically, scholars, political scientists look back at the first 2 Clinton years as a lot of spinning wheels and trying to figure out how to govern as a president. And I think that really speaks to what you're saying is like it's a learning. Everybody's learning at the
Everybody
same
was
time
learning. And you had a president. Bill Clinton is a genius. He is just
the smartest guy in the room.
Such a smart guy, such a charismatic guy, such a personality, and he was not being scripted for everything that he did, right? So you had a really dynamic White House too, where anyone could have tried to put from A to Z on paper, and that would just probably never happen, right?
Yeah.
But really smart people, a lot of people who were really committed to change, and really saw a North Star, and gosh, we had what, 12 years?
Yep.
Of a Republican administration. So it was an exciting time. I sometimes, just having done first term with both Clinton and Obama, have thought I'm not probably ever going to do another administration, but what must it be like to go in for a second term when everything is settled down and you have processes and you know how things work? Second term must be pretty darn amazing because you're doing great things, but it's a little more plug and chug. But January of inaugural year is probably your toughest time.
Sure.
Even with Clinton coming in, the Bush folks, when they left, had pulled all the hard drives out of the computers, and they had taken parts of the phone apart. So when you got in, we didn't even have working computers and phones. Everyone does. I think that's a little bit common, but you sort of hit the ground. I remember we got one computer and everyone's huddled around it trying to use one computer until you could get computers in.
Oh my goodness.
So it was, a little crazy.
You mentioned how the 1994 midterms, how important they were, and obviously in terms of the president's legislative agenda,
Mm-hmm.
That trajectory, the impact. But what was the impact on what was the effect on you, the political office? What was that election night and the aftermath like?
Crushing.
Not to trigger you, I apologize.
We had set up a war room because, again, you couldn't just look at your phone and see what CNN was doing. It was a really different game back then. But we had set up a war room in political affairs, and we were all staffing phones, and all of our contacts in the states were calling things in. And the political director at the time, Joan Baggett, kept coming into the room. What are you hearing? What are you hearing? And it's like, we've lost this state. We've lost this state. It was across the board. And I remember it was Joan Baggett or Doug Sosnick or someone saying, we've got to have some good news. And there were a couple cities that had, for some reason, elections that weren't off year. And I remember the guy sitting next to me was like, "Oh my God, we took Albuquerque." And that was one of the bright lights of the night. And to this day, sometimes we get together and have drinks, and we're like, "Oh my God, we took Albuquerque." It was a really depressing night, and even the next day, even though we weren't personally, on the ground involved with these campaigns, I remember walking through the halls of the White House, and people from other offices would say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" Right? It was a huge paradigm shift, and obviously affected the president's agenda because he had a lot of turnover and he lost control of the House. Yeah. And I ended up, I think mentally I had thought I was going to take time, it would be a little quieter after the midterms. And at this point too, I was like, okay, and I'm going to really get on that path of going back to school, and was going to have to reapply for law school, and then had decided I was going to apply to the Kennedy School as well, and had to take the GRE. So I was thinking, it'll calm down and I'll get my act together. And I mean, within a couple of days after the '94 election, the political director, I guess it was Doug Sosnick at the time, called me in and said, okay, we're sending you down to Miami. And I said, oh, it's so interesting. Well, first Summit of the Americas, the president was hosting all of the leaders from Latin American countries into Miami for a big summit. And Florida was one of my states that I worked with. And apparently there was a lot of turmoil going on in terms of lots of stakeholders in the state, who was going to get access to what, and tickets and credentials. And anytime you're dealing with a White House event, access is brutally important, and you can't make the governor of the Lawton Childs and Buddy McKay at the time, you can't put them in the front lines, but you had everyone of sort of every sort of demographic group, nationality, sort of chugging away. So I end up packing up and moving and living out of the Doral Hotel until we had the Summit of the Americas, working down in Miami, and never got my chance to study. And I think when I applied to the Kennedy School, I even wrote my essay by hand on Doral Hotel stationery. And I think it's a little bit of a miracle that I was accepted, by the way. I was like, I'm here in Miami working the Summit of the Americas. But that was another amazing experience. But again, all of these experiences involve sort of 24/7 and no sleep. And it was a huge success, but there was a gazillion events around it, and you had everyone from the administration down there, and it was kind of amazing. And so I went straight from '94 into that. So I didn't really have time to stop and think so much about, oh my gosh, what's happened after '94, because I was thrust into this other event. But it was, again, another amazing opportunity. But great thing to do when you're in your 20s. I could not have done that with a family if I had been married or had kids or anything like that. Yeah. So, it was the right opportunity at the right time.
I think that's something that I've really learned in all the interviews that I've done with staffers and party officials and activists, is how much, I don't think the general public appreciates how much of politics and public policy and government service is driven by people in their early to mid 20s. If you're 35, you're an old veteran in politics. And I think most people see the elected officials, especially members of Congress, senators, 70s, 80s, sometimes 90 years old. What they don't see is the 20 and 30 somethings who do the majority of the work behind the scenes.
Right.
And don't really get credit.
Sleep under your desk some nights. I mean, there is and that's where you get that camaraderie too, right? I mean, everyone was there all the time, and you can't have a social life really outside of work at that point. I mean, in those days, again, you couldn't take anything home with you. You couldn't leave the office till everything was done. So like I shared an office. They had these big old offices in the old executive office building, and I shared one of those offices with 3 guys, and we each had a corner. And there were times I wanted to kill them. Sure.
Everybody's had a roommate.
They could smell and leave their Diet Coke cans, and they spouted off crazy stuff, and some of my closest friends, honestly, and you just feel like you've gone through war together.
Right. And now, obviously, you moved down to Florida right as Keith moves up to the White House.
I didn't move down. I was just temporary down there.
Okay. So when
Keith was there.
Because he was
Keith and I overlapped quite a lot.
Intergovernmental relations.
So right next door to political affairs was intergovernmental affairs.
Well, there you go.
So there was Keith, and then he brought Lawton Jordan with him, who was there too, which was fantastic. I obviously had known Keith, and he came in within the first year, didn't he?
I thought he came in right. I thought he came in 94.
I feel like Keith and I had a decent amount of overlap because. Maybe Keith is such a good friend, and I, see him most of the time when he comes to DC. I mean, I feel like Keith's been such a part of my life that I don't know, I don't remember all of that very clearly, but I do remember Keith definitely being there, and he was definitely there for 94.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure he had a very different perspective on it because he came in at a much more senior level,
Right.
and at that point, he was like married, and he was in a very different point in his life.
Sure.
But I think Keith actually might have come and gone while I was there.
Okay.
So he came for a year.
Yeah.
So I think he came and left while I was still there.
Okay. Well, what was when you left the White House to go to the Kennedy School? Did you ever think you would be doing this again, or did you think you were turning the page and to begin a new change? I guess that's a long way of saying, what were you hoping to get out of graduate school, and what did you foresee for your future?
And why would I leave the White House when they were gearing up for the re-elect? Because could have stayed for another term. Yeah. I was very sensitive. You can get pegged as the political person, or you can get pegged as like the wonky policy person. Sure. I was very fearful that I was going to just get pegged as the political activist type. I really wanted to get more involved on the policy side, and it's actually kind of hard to make that leap, right? Once people view you as like the purely political person, hard to make the leap over. And I think vice versa. When you're in the sort of wonky world, no one thinks you have any political opinions. And it's funny because they were talking in the political affairs shop, we were talking about moving typically you would move the political affairs shop out to the re-elect. Once the re-elect is going, you have to make sure there's not sort of funny lines there. And so most of the political affairs staff sort of goes into the re-elect. And they were talking to me about my role with that. At the same time, there was a fabulous woman, Laura Tyson, who was a PhD economist. She was Clinton's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and then he had tapped her to become the director of the National Economic Council when Bob Rubin moved over to Treasury. Mm-hmm. And Laura's chief of staff, Tom O'Donnell, was one of my really close friends, but as Laura was transitioning from CEA to NEC and they were staffing up, they talked to me about taking a job at NEC. And I was really excited about that, but Laura, she would probably not remember this. I remember it because it had such an impact on me. Sorry, I'm picking up my microphone there. Laura gave me some of her time. I went up and sat in her office, and I said, and there were so few female role models too. And I said, I'm really trying to think about what to do. Should I stay with political, do the re-elect, come work for you, or should I go back to school? And I'm really up in the air. And she really invested some time, and she said, listen, particularly as a woman, and you want to be taken seriously, you're doing political stuff, and you're a woman, if you really, really want to be taken seriously, you really need to go get an advanced degree. Mm-hmm. And she was the person, I was so set at that, I was set on law school, and she said, I really think you should think about the Kennedy School, which growing up in Georgia, you don't run around a lot of people who, are like, I'm going to go after the Kennedy School. And she said, if you really want to do policy and you've already studied economics, like this would be a really good fit for you. And, it will really help you. And she, really, particularly as a woman, like you're gonna need that credentialing, right? People aren't going to just say, oh my gosh, you're brilliant. And I took it to heart. And I think when I told people, when I got my acceptance and I decided to go, there were a lot of people who thought I was a little crazy, right? You're going to leave the White House to go to policy school, and all the opportunity that we have here. And for me, I was ready, and I feared if I left it too long, I would never go. Sure. So leaving in the middle of everything, that opportunity cost was high. I'm super glad I did it. I think I could have done a wealth of programs. That particular program I loved. If you're in DC, there's an amazing Kennedy School network that is hard to match. I took out a lot of loans. It was not a cheap program.
That's something I can relate
and there was no Hope Scholarship for it. And so I went and did my 2 years, but when I came out, I had massive student debt, and I couldn't really consider going back into government. Government does not, what I wanted to do would not have paid a lot. And, you just think about these lucky things that happen in your life. I had come out of graduate school and gone briefly to New York, and Ed Sims, who, again, chairman of the Democratic Party, Ed, Keith, Gordon, Giffen, others were part of Long Aldridge and Norman, which has evolved today into Denton's. They had obviously a big Atlanta firm. Ed was in New York for a meeting, and he called me out of the blue and said, "Hey, is there any way we can meet for lunch?" And I said, "Great, that'd be wonderful." And he said, "You know what, we're going to open a DC office. Why don't you come back to DC and help us launch this DC office and do government relations for us out of Long Aldridge?" And it was people I knew, people I trusted. So I said, "You know what, let's do it." And so I spent several years at Long Aldridge, and again, kind of amazing opportunity. I did global work. I got to travel everywhere. I mean, it was, not relaxing, but a great opportunity. And was very happy at Long Aldridge, but then Citigroup came calling and offered me a sort of amazing opportunity to help launch a whole state local government relations program at a vice president level. And at that point I was like 30 years old, and it was sort of an incredible opportunity. Yeah. And at that point, financial services, there wasn't federal regulation, so everything's happening at the state level.
Before the
no, before.
Okay.
And so all the action is happening on the consumer side in the states. And so, again, a sort of another great opportunity. But what really brought me back to DC and got me into the mix was my old Georgia Democratic contacts coming out of the blue and saying, "Come and be part of helping us do something really neat and new in DC."
Well, at the expense of skipping ahead a bit, what convinced you to go back into government service and into the Obama White House in 2007, 2008, 2009, especially the 2009 transition? I guess.
Great question. So when I left Citi, I had gone to Bob Rubin, the former Treasury Secretary, had launched this economic policy group called the Hamilton Project, named after Alexander Hamilton, out of the Brookings Institution. And at that point, I was married and started having kids. I had a stepdaughter, I had a child at home, and I mean, honestly, traveling state to state was a bit challenging. And when Bob launched the Hamilton Project, I had inquired. I said, this sounds really interesting, and I still have that deep desire to move into policy. It was great that between Citi and Long Aldridge, I had paid off my student loans, so that was great.
Right.
But lobbying, I guess you could say it's a form of policy, but not that policy making I really sort of yearned for more at the think tank or government level. Sure. And so I got to be in on the front end of launching Hamilton Project and had been there 2.5 years, long enough that Obama White House did not let any registered lobbyists in. You had to have had a 2-year break, and so I had at least that 2-year break at Hamilton Project. The truth of the matter is the Hamilton Project team, I'm pretty sure almost the entire team when Obama was elected moved out, other than Doug Elmendorf, who became head of the Congressional Budget Office.
Right.
And Jason Furman, who had been with the Hamilton Project and then became one of Obama's chief economic advisors, had called me and said, "Would you come help in the transition with Council of Economic Advisors? You know all the sort of economic players at this point through Hamilton Project. It would be really helpful." So I wasn't viewing this as I'm going to jump in to the White House. I said, I'll come help with the transition. And transition turned into White House, and again, and at this point, financial crisis, the economy's tumbling, and so this became rather than political affairs office, the economic team became ground zero for the 24/7. And so even in the transition, we were starting what does the recovery plan look like, and then the implementation. But again, it was, as the president was elect Obama was being sworn in, we were there like ready with our boxes to get in the door, hit the ground running. And so it was, again, crazy not just first term, but first year stuff. And again, another truly incredible opportunity. Things happen in life that you don't always plan for. So I'm there doing my leave at 3 a.m, come back at 7, and eventually realized I was pregnant again, and ended up doing my whole pregnancy in the White House. But when my baby was born, take a little break and come back. And I just thought, you know what, I can't do that. As much as I'm committed and I would love to be part of that, those jobs are not 9 to 5. They're not even 9 to 7. And I already had 2 kids at home and a baby, and we all make our choices. And I made the choice to transition out and actually see my children and be there for my baby, which I don't regret at all. And at that point then, Bob Rubin and other colleagues called and said, we're ready to relaunch the Hamilton Project and do whatever you need to do with the baby, and we'll give you flexibility, and let's go back and relaunch. So it was great. And I will just say on that note too, again, now it's sort of a standard that you get maternity leave and you get all of these supports. That really didn't exist back then. When I had my first son at Citigroup, they did not even have a maternity leave policy. I took 6 weeks of disability, I think. And there was no such thing as like a lactation room. I mean, there was zero support for moms. I feel so lucky that I worked for a lot of men along the way who, when I said, here's my trade-off, like, I will get it all done, I'll do X, Y, and Z, but just give me the flexibility, because I want to be able to go to a soccer game, I want to be able to be at dinner with my kids. And I was able to create, not always, I was in the office. Sure. We didn't have remote work, hybrid working or anything like that, but for the time, I feel like, boy, I worked with folks who I think recognized that if push came to shove and if I had to choose, I was going to choose my family, and worked with me to create something that, was not, perfect, but made it where I could stay in the labor force, right, and do some really cool stuff.
Well, tell me what you're doing right now, and how you've sort of used that experience, both politically, policy-wise, and how does that manifest now?
So I am in a new job now that I started in September, and it's new. It's really new to me, and it's exciting, and it's, again, a huge learning curve. There's a nonprofit called Social Finance. It's been around over a dozen years, does incredible work with impact investing and outcomes-based funding. Really, in a nutshell, using very innovative outcomes-based financial tools to promote economic mobility, right? In a really positive way, really trying to help your most disadvantaged populations, and raising a lot of philanthropic capital to do some great innovative stuff, whether it's workforce training programs, home health visiting programs, traditional impact investing. And they've been doing great work in the US for over a dozen years, and they raised money. And everything can be great, but if you can't scale it and you can't sort of start doing this at a broader level, you're not going to have the impact you want to have. So they came up with the idea of launching an institute, which would be a platform for learning applied research, tools, what works, what doesn't work, how do we bring stakeholders together to create networking. And so they raised money to launch an institute to be that base of learning, did a national search for someone to lead it, and they came to me. And I am not at all an expert on impact investing, but I've launched several things, and I do have now a really good, solid economic policy background. And they offered me this opportunity to launch this institute. So I'm in the process of hiring a team, setting our agenda. And it's really exciting, trying to think about how do we really scale the impact around what we know works in impact investing and outcomes-based financing, and trying to reach broader populations. And I love it because after being on the more academic side now for a while, it's definitely more it's much closer to ground level, right? And you're seeing the direct impacts in the communities, and it's something I really wanted. And this might be my last big job of my career, but I wanted it to be something that I, truly felt like I was making a difference.
Well, looking back on your career, what advice would you give to young undergrads and students at Agnes Scott, UGA, and that we live in I don't think this is controversial, a fairly cynical and sometimes dark time in politics and government. What advice would you give to young people considering a career in government service, or even just testing the waters here in Washington and elsewhere?
Well, first of all, with the University of Georgia, how amazing that there's the DC program, that you can actually dip your toe in the water and get a sense of DC. Federal government's exciting, but so much right now is going on at the state and local level. So I think having, even if it's a year or two, if you have some interest in policy and government, investing a year or two at least in government to just get a sense of what it's about. I think a lot of times people sit on the outside and they want to criticize government, or why aren't you moving faster? And you have to kind of get into government to understand the constraints that you're dealing with, right? I mean, it's not, as much as people want to say, let's run government like a business. Government is not set up like a business. You can't make it, we have a lot of checks and balances and controls and regulations, and there's a reason for that. And so I think it's equally beneficial to have experience in the private sector, public sector, and really understand those perspectives. But boy, what an amazing opportunity to learn a lot and do a lot, I think, depending on what you're doing in government. But a lot of these jobs are ones that they're going to toss a lot at you, and you're going to have a lot of opportunity. The bigger thing I would say is, I think it's hard, maybe it's easier, probably a little easier now. I think a lot of the jobs that people might really love doing, they just don't even know that they exist. Or maybe they don't even exist yet. I would never have, I had no concept of jobs like policy, politics. If you had asked me what a lobbyist is, I just wouldn't have had a sense when I was in college, and didn't have people to talk to in that realm, and so couldn't even sort of learn along the way. The field is evolving really rapidly, and there's policy is government, it's service providers, it's the think tanks, it's advocacy groups, it's trade associations. There's so much there. I would say, really go out and experiment and get a sense of what's out there, and see what you like. Try one thing, try another thing. We're sort of past the day where you go to one job and stay there for 20 years. But don't just sort of sit on the sidelines and have a quick judgment or think that you have a sense of what it is. Be brave and go out there and try it, and give it a good shot, and then learn from the people in that ecosystem about what the options are. Network, right? Don't be afraid to, my kids are horrible at this. I say, you're not asking someone to buy you a car. You're asking for a conversation, right? Be brave and go out and talk to people, and then ask if they can set you up for a couple of conversations, and invest in figuring out what your options are.
Right. Well, as we wrap up, anything you final reflections about your time in politics, government, things you're particularly proud of?
Well, I appreciate the conversation. I feel incredibly fortunate. Again, I'm from public schools of Athens, Georgia, with no connection to government policy, and I just feel so fortunate that I had people support me along the way. And I'm a pay it forward kind of person. I think we all owe that to other people as well. But I am so grateful for the whole Georgia Zell Miller crowd and the opportunities that were open to me, and I think it's pretty incredible. It's amazing. I'm sure everyone says this about the administration or the group that they work in, but that Zell Miller community is an amazing group of people. Really amazing group of people, and they're still my friends to this day.
Well, Karen, thank you so much. On behalf of the father of a Clark County student, the husband of a Clark County first grade teacher, thank you so much for taking some time this Friday to talk about your career in politics and government service.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Karen.